On January 20th, 1943, the Volga wind scraped through the broken masonry of Stalingrad and turned every exposed nail into a needle. Sergeant Ivan Petrov dragged a wooden crate across a staircase that had lost its steps, found a flat patch of rubble, and set the crate down like it was a table. The crate held a generator, 2 horn loudspeakers, and a spool of cable that had been rewound so many times the copper inside felt tired. He got the equipment into position. The position, however, sat in the open, and he paid for that immediately with the first burst of German mortar fire that made the dust leap and his teeth chatter. He crawled into a cellar and waited for the pounding to stop, then climbed back out and checked the horns for cracks. The horns survived. The cable did not, because shrapnel had nicked it and the insulation peeled back like bark. He spliced the wire with numb fingers, made the connection hold, and watched his assistant, Corporal Mitya, crank the generator rope until it coughed. The generator finally caught. The cost was a smell of gasoline in the cellar air and the knowledge that if the Germans could hear the engine, they could range the next mortars closer. Ivan's orders were simple on paper. Support psychological warfare for the 64th Army sector by broadcasting surrender messages into the German positions. The reality was messier, because the front line in central Stalingrad was not a line at all. It was a ragged seam running through rooms, stairwells, and frozen courtyards, where a man could be Soviet in the kitchen and German in the bedroom. Ivan unrolled his cable into that seam. The result was that every meter he laid brought the speakers closer to the enemy. The cost was that every meter also brought him closer to the enemy's rifles and closer to the temptation to turn back. Captain Sokolov, a political officer with cheeks cracked raw from the cold, brought Ivan a folder wrapped in oilcloth. Inside were translated snippets from interrogation notes and captured German paperwork, ration tallies, unit designations, and the grim arithmetic of starvation. Ivan did not need the folder to know the Germans were hungry. He could smell it when prisoners came in, a sourness beneath wool and blood. But the folder gave the hunger a number: bread rations down to a few ounces a day, sometimes less, and meat scraped from frozen horses when it could be found. He read the numbers. The cost was that the numbers turned living men into a countdown he could weaponize. Sokolov wanted the broadcast to sound like certainty, not hope. Ivan wanted the broadcast to sound like truth, because truth carried farther than slogans. He took a pencil and began writing a script that did not promise paradise, only the next hour. Surrender, and you will be fed. Surrender, and your wounded will be treated. Surrender, and you will live. The result was a message that felt almost humane. The cost was that the sentence, "You will live," was a gamble Ivan could not guarantee, and he felt the lie in his mouth before he ever spoke it. The first time Ivan switched on the speakers, his own soldiers flinched. The horns did not play music yet. They played a steady metronome tick, recorded on a crude device and looped. Between ticks, Ivan spoke German phrases he had learned in training and then forgotten in the chaos of war. He read slowly so the consonants would not freeze in his throat. The sound carried over the rubble and into the ruined apartments beyond. The result was silence from the German side, as if the city itself were holding its breath. The cost was the sudden sensation that Ivan had pushed his voice into a place where it could be shot. An hour later, a German machine gun opened up in reply, firing blind through smoke toward the sound. Bullets cracked against brick and kicked sparks from metal beams. Ivan and Mitya killed the generator and lay flat in the cellar until the burst ended. The speakers survived again. A Soviet infantryman did not, because he had stood to watch the horns as if they were a miracle. Ivan saw the man fall. The cost of being heard became a body on the stairs, and Ivan understood that psychological warfare still demanded blood like any other weapon. That night, the temperature sank toward -30, and the generator oil thickened until the crank felt like turning bone. Ivan warmed the engine casing with his hands and with a small stove that burned splinters of furniture. The engine started anyway, and that small success felt obscene because men around him were dying for the lack of a stove and a splinter. He kept the generator running. The cost was the fuel he stole from a supply meant for cooking and the resentment he earned from the cook who watched him siphon it. On January 22nd, Sokolov arrived with a new scrap of intelligence. Earlier in the month, Soviet envoys had approached German lines under a white flag with a final ultimatum, and the Germans had refused. Ivan did not witness that exchange. He only held the translated summary in his hands. Still, the paper gave him a lever. He rewrote his script to include a deadline that had already passed, because past deadlines were proof of future doom. The result was that the message gained a hard edge. The cost was that Ivan felt like he was tightening a noose he could not see. Lieutenant Lydia Karpova, a translator assigned to the army staff, came to Ivan's cellar with a stack of phonograph records scavenged from a destroyed cultural club. The labels were in German. She said nothing sentimental about them. She simply told Ivan that men broke differently when they heard music from home. Ivan took the records. The cost was that he had to accept that nostalgia could be used the way shrapnel was used, to cut what was already exposed. They waited for the next clear night and played the first record, a gentle dance tune that might have floated from a radio in Berlin or Munich before the war. It drifted through the horns and out over the ruins, thin at first, then strong enough to be recognized. The result was not immediate surrender. The result was a change in the German firing rhythm, a pause between bursts, as if fingers on triggers had loosened. The cost was that Ivan's own men, crouched in the cellar, stared at the ceiling with expressions that looked like grief, because the music was foreign, but the longing inside it was not. Sokolov demanded that Ivan follow the music with facts, not mercy. Ivan obeyed. He let the last notes fade, then returned to the metronome tick and the cold German sentence. Every 7 seconds, one German soldier dies. He repeated it. After each statement, he inserted a tick and then added, "Now one more is dead." The result was that the broadcast no longer sounded like persuasion. It sounded like a ledger being read aloud. The cost was that Ivan began to hear the ticks in his own head, even when the generator was off, and he could not tell whether that was the weapon working or his own mind cracking. On January 23rd, a runner brought word that a small German patrol had tried to creep close to the speaker position in the darkness, guided by the sound of the generator. Ivan never saw the patrol. He only saw the 2 bodies dragged in at dawn and the torn white armbands that marked them as reconnaissance. The result was confirmation that the Germans were hunting the horns the way they hunted machine gun nests. The cost was that Ivan had to move the speakers closer to the Soviet infantry so they could be protected, and closer to the front so his voice would carry, which meant the enemy's shells would carry too. He shifted the horns into the shell of a bathhouse, placing them behind a shattered wall that faced a German-held courtyard. He ran the cable through a drainage pipe and set the generator deeper underground. The result was a position that could broadcast without immediately betraying the engine's location. The cost was hours of labor in freezing water and an infection that started in Ivan's fingertips, because he had peeled off his gloves to make the splice and then could not feel them again for a day. By January 24th, the folder of intelligence gained another page. Reports that Field Marshal Paulus had signaled that his situation was hopeless and asked Berlin for permission to break out or surrender, and that the answer had been no. Ivan could not verify the message chain. He could only trust that the staff would not hand him a lie that mattered. He built the report into his broadcast anyway. The result was a new refrain that cut deeper than hunger. Your commander asked to save you. He was refused. The cost was that this line, more than the ticks, stirred rage in the German trenches, and the next afternoon they fired artillery at the bathhouse until the wall behind which the horns sat became dust. Ivan and Mitya dragged the horns out by their cables as the bathhouse collapsed. The horns scraped on brick and screamed with feedback. The result was that they saved the equipment. The cost was that Mitya's ankle twisted in the rubble and swelled instantly, and Ivan had to choose between carrying a loudspeaker or carrying a man. He carried the man, and the horn had to wait, and that delay meant the next broadcast slot was lost. The staff's daily situation report on January 25th included a line that Ivan read twice because it felt like a sentence from another war. Pitomnik airfield no longer functioned as a reliable lifeline. Ivan had heard the name Pitomnik for weeks, spoken like a prayer in German documents and prisoner mouths because it was where transports might land with food and where wounded might fly out. Now it was gone in practice, and soon Gumrak would follow. Ivan carried the report to Sokolov. The result was an opportunity because a starving man who knows there is no more bread coming begins to bargain with fate. The cost was that an army with no airfield left becomes an animal cornered, and cornered animals bite. Ivan's next broadcast was stripped of poetry. He read the names of the airfields and described what their loss meant in plain German words. He spoke of wounded men who would no longer be evacuated, of the sick who would no longer be flown out, of bread that would not arrive. The result was a strange echo from across the courtyard. Not gunfire, but a shouted insult in German that sounded exhausted. The cost was that hearing the enemy's voice this close made Ivan suddenly aware of the thinness of the wall between them, and he slept that night with his rifle across his chest, even in the cellar. Lydia brought him another stack of records, and this time the choices were darker. Songs that soldiers had marched to, sentimental waltzes that spoke of rivers and home. Ivan argued with her that music might harden resistance as easily as it softened it. Lydia did not argue back. She simply pointed at the interrogations in Sokolov's folder, where a prisoner had written that the music made him think of his mother's kitchen and that the thought made him want to die. Ivan put the records on the table. The result was a decision to keep using music. The cost was accepting that despair could be as useful as hope. On January the 27th, the Soviet offensive that the staff called Operation Ring tightened the siege by another notch. Ivan did not see the maps. He saw the casualties. He watched stretcher bearers bring men through the snow with faces wrapped in cloth because their skin could tear away from the cold air. The result was that the Soviet side was paying its own price to close the trap. The cost for Ivan was more immediate. His political superiors demanded results, and results meant enemy units surrendering in numbers large enough to be counted. He complied by turning the broadcast into a routine that could not be escaped. At dawn, he played music. At mid-morning, he read surrender terms. At midday, he returned to the tick-tock and the death statistic. And at night, he played the music again, as if it were a lullaby. The result was that the Germans began to time their firing around the broadcasts, as if the horns had become part of the day's weather. The cost was that Ivan's own soldiers began to curse him, because the horns also marked time for them, and time in Stalingrad was the slow movement toward frostbite and loss. A lieutenant from the infantry company guarding the broadcast position came to Ivan with a complaint. Men were starting to mutter the ticks under their breath, and one had tried to smash the gramophone with his entrenching tool. Ivan went outside and stood in the wind so they could see his face. He told them that the horns were not for entertainment. He did not tell them he had begun to hear the ticks even when he was alone. The result was that the men backed down because a sergeant's authority still mattered. The cost was that Ivan felt himself becoming a kind of jailer for his own side, enforcing a weapon that wounded friend and enemy alike. In the last week of January, more German prisoners arrived, many too weak to stand without help. Ivan had been taught to treat prisoners as sources of intelligence. Now they looked like mirrors. He offered one a cup of warm water and listened as the man described eating sawdust mixed into black bread and sucking on leather straps to quiet his stomach. The result was confirmation that the ration numbers were not exaggerations. The cost was that Ivan could no longer pretend his broadcasts were a clean instrument. They were a lever pressed into the ribs of men who were already broken. On January 30th, Captain Sokolov entered the cellar without knocking and shut the door behind him as if the air itself might be listening. He handed Ivan a fresh translation. Berlin had promoted Paulus to Field Marshal. Ivan understood the signal at once, not because he was a historian, but because soldiers learn the language of symbols quickly. A field marshal did not surrender. A field marshal died, and his death made other men obey. The result was that Ivan suddenly had the most devastating line he could speak. The cost was that using it would mean pushing thousands of strangers closer to a choice between suicide and captivity. Ivan asked Lydia how to say field marshal correctly in German. Lydia pronounced the word slowly so he could shape it with his frozen lips. Ivan wrote it down and practiced until it no longer sounded foreign. Then he rewrote the broadcast. He did not say, "Your commander is honored." He said, "Your commander has been promoted because Berlin expects him to die." The result was that the message aligned with what the Germans already feared but could not admit. The cost was that Ivan felt he had crossed from persuasion into execution. That evening, he played a German tango record first, something soft and ordinary. He let it run almost to the end. Then he switched to the metronome and spoke the new line about the promotion. He followed it with the older statistic, every 7 seconds. He added, "A field marshal does not live to be captured, so ask yourself what Berlin wants from you." The result was that gunfire stopped entirely for several minutes. The cost was that the silence made Ivan's stomach clench, because silence could mean surrender, or it could mean men preparing to rush the Soviet line in a final frenzy. No rush came. Instead, a single voice called out in German from the courtyard, cracked and furious. Ivan could not catch every word, but he caught liars and dogs, and a phrase that sounded like, "We will die anyway." Ivan answered with the only truth he could guarantee. "Yes, you will die anyway. You can decide how." The result was that the voice fell quiet. The cost was that Ivan's reply sounded like a confession even to himself. After midnight, Mitya's swollen ankle turned black at the edges, and the medical assistant attached to their sector told Ivan that if Mitya did not get warmth, he would lose the foot. Ivan could not give warmth. He could only give a place near the generator and hope the fumes did not kill him first. The result was that Mitya lived through the night. The cost was that Ivan began to hate the generator because its heat felt like stolen life. On January 31st, just before dawn, the staff message came that the 64th Army would push into the city center and that a German headquarters position was expected in the area of the department store. Ivan's loudspeaker team was ordered forward with the assault elements to broadcast surrender instructions at point-blank range. He loaded the horns onto a sled and tied the cables down with wire. The result was that his weapon would move with the infantry. The cost was that his shelter, thin as it was, vanished behind him, and the open street ahead was a corridor of death. Ivan followed the assault group through a gap blasted in a wall, then down a trench that had been dug through snow and corpse-stiff rubble. The horns bounced on the sled, and each bounce threatened to crack the diaphragms. He kept one hand on the equipment as if it were a child. The result was that he stayed close enough to fix it if it broke. The cost was that staying close also meant staying close when the German machine guns opened fire from a window above, and 2 men in front of him dropped before he could duck. They reached the department store building after sunrise, if it could be called sunrise in a sky that was mostly smoke. The structure looked like a gutted skull, with blackened beams and empty window sockets. Ivan's escort officer pointed to a side entrance leading to a stairwell. Ivan threaded his cable down into the darkness and set one horn at the top of the stairs, aimed downward. The result was a direct channel into the German command space. The cost was that the stairwell was a funnel, and if the Germans threw a grenade upward, the blast would take Ivan first. He began broadcasting surrender instructions in German. Lay down arms, come out one at a time, hands visible. He kept his voice steady even when his throat burned. The result was movement below, a shuffling sound that could have been men or rats. The cost was that every second he spoke was another second the Germans could triangulate his position, and a sniper's bullet could end his work mid-syllable. A Soviet lieutenant with a pistol in hand descended the stairs with a translator at his shoulder. Ivan did not follow because his job was to keep the horn alive. He watched from the landing as shadows moved in the lower corridor. The result was that his perspective narrowed to fragments, a glimpse of a German helmet, the scrape of a boot, the click of a weapon being set down. The cost was that he could not control what happened below, only the tone of the words that hovered above it. When the first German officer emerged, he looked older than his years and smaller than his uniform suggested, as if the siege had shaved him down. He held a scrap of paper in one hand and made a gesture that might have been a salute or might have been a plea. The Soviet lieutenant took the paper and waved the man onward. The result was the first proof that the horn had become a door. The cost was that the sight of a man surrendering in such a quiet way made Ivan suddenly ashamed of the tics he had used, because this surrender was not a number. More Germans came, each one blinking at the daylight as if it were unnatural. They moved past Ivan without looking at him. The result was a stream of prisoners that grew into a column. The cost was that the column clogged the stairwell and forced Soviet soldiers to shove the weak aside so the line could keep moving, and even saw a man fall and be stepped over without protest from anyone. Then, near midday, the Soviet escort officer returned to the landing and spoke a single sentence. The commander was inside. Ivan heard the word Paulus and felt his mouth go dry. He had repeated the name on broadcasts as an abstraction, as if it were a title. Now it was a person in a basement. The result was that Ivan's work had a center. The cost was that centers attract chaos, and the stairwell filled with armed men who did not trust each other's nerves. Ivan kept the horn running while the Soviet officers descended again, slower this time. He did not see Paulus at first. He saw only a cluster of German staff officers, their collars dirty, their eyes hollow. The translator's voice carried up from below, clipped and professional. The result was that the surrender began to sound like paperwork, which was safer than gunfire. The cost was that the professionalism also made the moment feel unreal, as if history were being signed in a room that smelled of damp wool and candle smoke. At last, Paulus came into view on the lower steps, escorted by Soviet soldiers. He wore a heavy coat over his uniform and moved stiffly, as if his joints had frozen into place. Ivan expected defiance. What he saw was exhaustion held upright by habit. The result was that the myth of an invincible commander shrank into a tired man. The cost was that a tired man could still be killed by a nervous guard. And Ivan watched every finger on every trigger. Someone spoke in German below, and the translator answered in Russian. Ivan could not hear every word, but he caught the tone, a refusal, flat and final. Later, he would learn what that refusal meant. In the moment, he only understood that Paulus was not performing the death Berlin had implied. The result was that the Field Marshal promotion had failed to produce a corpse. The cost was that this failure would become another kind of weapon in Soviet hands, a symbol to use against Hitler and to use against the remaining German pockets still holding out. Paulus and the staff were led out of the building and placed under guard. Ivan's unit was ordered to pack up and move south to Beketovka, where the 64th Army headquarters would process high-value prisoners. Ivan loaded the horns onto the sled again and trudged behind the escort column. The result was a relocation that felt like a victory march without music. The cost was that along the route, Ivan saw German wounded lying against walls, too weak to join the column, and Soviet soldiers pushing them with rifle barrels until they moved or did not. At Beketovka, Ivan watched the formalities through a doorway. Paulus sat under guard while Soviet officers recorded names and units. The translator repeated questions. Paulus answered with a quiet that sounded like resignation more than obedience. The result was that surrender became a document, stamped and filed. The cost was that filing did nothing to warm the men outside who were still dying in the snow. Sokolov found Ivan that evening and asked whether the broadcast had been worth it. Ivan wanted to say yes because that would justify the dead Soviet infantrymen on the stairs and the fuel stolen from cooks and the ticks that haunted his skull. Instead, he answered with a practical report. German units in their sector were surrendering in larger groups after broadcasts that combined music, ration facts, and the Field Marshal line. The result was that Sokolov could write a success narrative. The cost was that Ivan realized he had become part of a narrative machine, turning suffering into a statistic for headquarters. On February 1st, Ivan was ordered back toward the city edge to broadcast to the northern German pocket that still resisted. He set the horn on a mound of snow and played the same tango record. The result was that men who had not eaten properly in days heard a reminder of cafes, dance halls, and warmth. The cost was that Ivan's own hands shook as he placed the needle, because he now understood exactly how cruel that reminder was. After the music, he read a new message approved by staff. Paulus was in captivity, the southern pocket had surrendered, and further resistance would only increase the dead. The result was that some German soldiers emerged with their hands up within the hour. The cost was that others did not, and the Soviet artillery resumed its work, and Ivan listened to the shells and wondered whether his words had shortened the fight or only accompanied it like a soundtrack. On February 2nd, the last organized resistance in the Stalingrad cauldron collapsed. Ivan did not witness the signing of any final paper. He witnessed the physical fact of thousands of men walking out of cellars and trenches, eyes down, arms hanging, as if the bones inside were heavier than rifles. The result was a river of prisoners that the Soviets counted, tens of thousands, approaching 90,000 in total. The cost was that counting did not change what those men looked like. Many were already dying, and the march to collection points would finish what hunger and cold had begun. Ivan was assigned to a column assembly point on the edge of the ruined city, where his horn became an instrument of logistics. He barked German commands learned from Lydia: "Line up in fives, keep distance, do not stop." The result was order, the kind of order armies depend on. The cost was that order required pushing the weak, and Ivan watched a soldier with wrapped feet collapse and get hauled up by two others who could barely stand, and he knew that order here was a synonym for dragging bodies forward until they quit. At night, when the generator was finally shut down, Ivan sat in a half-collapsed shed and heard the ticks anyway. He tried to drown them with the memory of the tango, but the tune broke apart in his head and reassembled as footsteps on snow. The result was that his weapon had moved inside him. The cost was that he could not share this with anyone, because admitting that a tool had wounded its wielder would be taken as weakness, and weakness in that winter could be fatal. Lydia found him with a small notebook and asked him to write down the scripts he had used, word for archiving. Ivan copied the German lines as carefully as he could, including the Field Marshal announcement and the death statistic. The result was a record that could be used to train other units or to brag to Moscow about ingenuity. The cost was that writing the lines fixed them in ink, and ink made them harder to forget. Days later, Ivan watched the prisoner columns start their longer march away from the Volga, toward railheads and camps deeper inland. He heard Soviet guards joke that the war was already decided, and he saw German prisoners stare at the snow as if it were the only honest thing left. The result was a victory that stretched beyond the city ruins. The cost was a new kind of silence, because the horns were packed away, and without them the city did not feel peaceful. It felt emptied. Ivan carried the gramophone records back to the cellar where he had first played them. The sleeves were torn, and the vinyl had chips along the edges. He stacked them anyway, as if they were evidence from a trial. The result was a small museum of sounds that had helped break an army. The cost was the awareness that the sounds had also broken something in him, because he could no longer hear a melody without wondering what it might be used to make a stranger feel. When spring came months later and the ice on the Volga began to loosen, Ivan returned once to the riverbank and looked across the water where the city's skeleton still stood. He did not pray. He did not celebrate. He simply listened to the wind and tried to measure it without turning it into a weapon. The result was a moment of quiet that did not feel like peace. The cost was a question that kept returning with the steadiness of a metronome. Why were they here, and where, after so much sound, could anyone still call home?